Welcome back to Adam versus the Man. Turbulence has become common in the Middle East, especially in recent days. Tensions have escalated dramatically in what could be a rapid transformation of the Israeli-Palestine peace process, for better or for worse. 2 weeks ago, Egypt brokered a deal between the two major power structures in Palestine, Hamas and Fatah, and on Friday, U.S. Special Middle East Envoy George Mitchell resigned. Only 2 days later, Sunday, on the 63rd anniversary of Israel's creation, rowdy demonstrations made their way to Israel's borders, commemorating what the Arab world refers to as the Nakba, which translates into catastrophe, the founding of the Jewish state. Tens of thousands of protesters clashed with the Israeli military, and at least 15 protesters have been killed at the Israeli borders of Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. Israel has vowed a tough response to any more of what they are calling incursions, and are blaming Syria and Iran for the clashes. With us to talk about these developments and what they mean for the future of the Middle East and U.S. involvement in the region are Dr. Marc Gopin, Director of the Center on Religion, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University's Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and author of Healing the Heart of Conflict. Also joining us, Anna Baltzer, an award-winning lecturer and author of Witness in Palestine, a Jewish American woman in the occupied territories. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So, do these, what we saw this weekend at the Israeli borders, the annual commemoration, this is nothing new, perhaps invigorated by the sentiment of the Arab Spring, does it rise to the level of incursions at this point?
Well, I think that it's unprecedented for very complicated political reasons of what's going on inside of Syria, and also the new relationship between Hamas and the Fatah, and what happened in Egypt. So, for all of those complicated reasons, this particular Nakba Day had a new feature of people on all of the borders in an unprecedented way.
So, numbers-wise, size-wise, how do you think it compares to previous Nakba demonstrations?
Well, I think what's distinctive is actually the focus on the borders and the notion of the ingathering of the exiles, and the success of an incursion in the Golan, which is something that is unprecedented, and it suggests that something profound is changing in the region. I believe it's a veiled threat, that Syria is experiencing its own disastrous form of the Arab Spring, and they're threatening that Israel could also experience that if they continue to have trouble in Syria. So it's complicated in its relationship between states, and at the same time, it suggests the new power of people in the region. It's intimating that it's following on the heels of that.
Anna, do you agree with that analysis?
Yeah, I sure do. I think it really illustrates the feeling of the power of people coming together and demanding their rights, as we've seen all over the Arab world, and we're seeing today continuously. It's not new in Palestine. Palestinians have been speaking out and demanding their rights for a very long time, but we see now on the heels of all these other protests, it's a time of great hope.
So, do you think there's
or the escalation?
Oh, we had a frozen feed. We have Anna back. Okay, Anna, sorry. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
I think also the fact that it's happening on the borders is significant. I think what it really shows is a kind of unity of the Palestinian people. Oftentimes, Palestinians have really been categorized simply as the people who are living in the West Bank and Gaza. But in fact, those living under the 1967 occupation are really the minority of Palestinians. Many are in exile. So this shows a kind of unity, that the Nakba is something that is commemorated, the exile of the majority of the Palestinian population is commemorated by Palestinians all over the world, not only those in the West Bank and Gaza, but that they are one people, and they're all demanding their rights, whether it's an end to the occupation, refugee rights, or equal rights within Israel itself.
Well, if this rises to the level of an incursion, do you think the Israeli response this weekend was appropriate?
As far as I know, I wasn't there. These were attacks on civilian protesters, and it's nothing new. You have places like Belain, you have villages within the West Bank where Palestinians are marching week after week in nonviolent demonstrations, and they're met, and I've been there, with tear gas and bombs and even live ammunition. We've seen the escalation, really, of attacks on nonviolent protesters. So it doesn't surprise me that there would be attacks on civilians, and unfortunately now we see, I think you said, more than 15 killed, and I don't think there's any excuse for it.
Okay, now let me open this up for a second, because the reason protests are put down is because they lead to real change. And in this case, you know, we're comparing what happened around Israel this past weekend to what we saw in Tunisia, what we saw in Egypt, what we're seeing in Syria. If the protests around Israel were not put down violently, if the peaceful masses were able to assemble where they would and demand that the change that they would, what would it look like?
Well, I think that in that sense, the idea of calling it an incursion when people come to a border without arms and they say we want to cross because our homeland is on the other side is something actually taking us back all the way to 1948, in the sense that there were incursions from 48 to 50 of people trying to walk back to their homes, and they were shot on a fairly regular basis. The heyday of what's comfortable for Israel and the West is when Palestinians did this as terrorist acts. Real guerrillas who came with serious intentions for terrible violence that was committed in the 60s and 70s. This is a return to nonviolent resistance in massive forms that's very similar to what's going on in the other countries of the Middle East, and it's an unprecedented wellspring of Arab and Palestinian moves at this point, almost chess moves.
Is this the big hope, that all of these sentiments that are so deeply ingrained in the Arab community in the Middle East are now being manifest by nonviolent means because they've been shown how nonviolence can work?
Well, I personally think that it's a step in that direction, and we'll see how long that lasts, depending on Israel's reaction.
Anna?
Sorry, Anna.
I certainly agree that we see the growth of a nonviolent movement, but it's certainly not anything new. I mean, there's been all kinds of nonviolent popular movements throughout Palestinian history, but absolutely, it is a time of I think, great potential.
So what makes this case different then, Anna? What makes this different from Tunisia and Egypt and Syria? Obviously, the Israeli state, but what about that prevents this from being manifest as immediately as we saw in those other cases?
Well, the Palestinian people are not in a similar really situation to what we saw, for example, in Egypt. The Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, for example, are living under a military occupation. The idea that every attempt at organizing, at building up civil society and civilian infrastructure is systematically undermined by the occupation forces. Those living in the diaspora, the exiled population, do not even have the luxury of protesting within their own homeland. So it is a fundamentally different context, but that doesn't mean that the same spirit of a demanding of equal rights, of a demanding of a chance to live a life of dignity and humanity is not the consistent thread through them all.
All right, so if this is what's happening, if we're really seeing a turn to nonviolence and a new hope for Arab activism that's a distinct, especially in Palestine and Israel, that's getting away from the history of violence, as you pointed out, what's the next hope? What's going to come of this next? Obviously, we have that popular sentiment running up against the state of Israel. Doctor, we've only got just a minute left here.
Well, we have some very powerful moves. We have a move towards unilateral declaration of statehood that's putting enormous pressure on Israel to respond in some new way. I don't think that enough pressure has been put yet for the Israeli electorate to really rethink their relationship with the Palestinian people, and I'm hoping that President Obama can capitalize on these moves and shift us towards a much more aggressive form of diplomacy.
Just a second left. Anna, your hope?
Yes, I think it's important as we look at the events unfolding within the Middle East that we recognize our role in it, not only as Americans paying for what's happening, and we need to demand, of course, that U.S. support for illegal occupations and discriminatory policies, but also that we play a part. And one thing I work on with the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, and you can find out more at endtheoccupation.org, is a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, to say as long as we as long as our government is paying billions and billions of dollars to support these things, we're going to stop profiting off of it. Just like Gandhi, just like Martin Luther King, just like the anti-apartheid South Africa movement said we're going to apply pressure not only by asking and hoping, but by really
find our own nonviolent means of resistance here at home. Correct?
That's right. In solidarity.
All right. I'm sorry. That's all the time we have. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, Professor. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Dr. Marc Gopin and Anna Baltzer. So, Friday night, just a little sneak preview here. Co-producer Dustin and I went to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund 23rd Annual Candlelight Vigil, which was part of National Police